Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Dr. Anton Howes. Anton is a historian and the author of the book, Arts and Minds, How the Royal Society of Arts Changed a Nation. Anton, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Erik. Thanks for having me.
So, Anton, by way of introduction, why don't you sort of expound, when you look back on the arc of your career and sort of intellectual journey, what is the thread that ties everything together? Or what are the questions that you keep on asking?
I guess a lot of it comes down to cultures of innovation. How is it that people create? There's not only how is it that people invent things, but how is it that people create the conditions in which invention becomes less costly, more desirable, more socially desirable, and just in general easier. So how is it that you get these kind of fantastic hubs or golden ages or efflorescences or whatever you want to call them from time to time? And then especially how is it that we got the modern world in that, you know, we've been riding this wave of continuous improvement for at least the past few hundred years, and it's been spreading from country to country, and our ability to create new technologies has been improving, it seems, I think, to me. I know there's a bit of debate about this recently, but yeah, I think ultimately, if I was to pick out a particular thread, it comes down to how we create those cultures, or really not even cultures, subcultures, small-ish groups of people who can maybe have a wider impact on society at large, either through the inventions themselves or through the kinds of norms or memes that they propagate, but really ultimately coming down to these very small groups of people.
And you spent a lot of time looking at those subcultures in England, among other places. Talk about how you discovered what your sort of intellectual journey was in discovering that, and what surprised you about it, or how you sort of came to spend so much time focusing there.
Yeah, so I started off being just interested in economic growth. I observed, there was a kind of actually a sort of weird coincidence perhaps, is that I'd just been happening to be kind of fiddling around with data on GDP per capita growth in the 20th century. I noticed that when the Soviet Union came into being, Russian technology seems to have basically just kind of stopped at the level that was pretty much the most advanced level in Britain and America at the time. And so that was the level that they reached in the 1980s in terms of GDP per capita. It was almost as if they'd kind of had this shut off where they'd imported all of these technologies in up to 1910, 1920, and then continued using those technologies and then getting the most out of them, such that by the 1980s, they'd kind of begun to stagnate. Now, obviously, there was lots of innovation in the Soviet Union as well around that. You know, they did well with the space race, and there were obviously encouragements and awards for inventors, even if they may not have had quite the same effect as they did in other countries and in the West in particular. But what struck me there is that there was something important, a political story there. But then that took me to looking at Britain in particular and the causes of how we get that kind of modern economic growth in the first place. And actually the most striking thing I discovered was that although politics matters in extreme cases like the Soviet Union, or today maybe you'd look at North Korea, actually in general politics doesn't seem to matter at all. If you look at Britain's growth over the past few hundred years, it's pretty steady. It's, 1 to 2, maybe pushing 2.5% growth per year every single year, pretty much, with ups and downs, of course, but really kind of coming back to that baseline level. And that's the same across most countries that have had that innovation bug for the past few hundred years, including places like France. So I like to joke that, France has had pretty steady economic growth, and yet it's already on its fifth republic. So it's not as though, it's been going backwards and forwards between monarchy, emperorship, republic, back to whatever other kind of weird configuration of these political regimes, and all sorts of different laws and all sorts of different policies. And yet economic growth, which modern economic growth, so this continuous thing driven by technological improvement, more so than any other factor, that seems to have been extremely steady. And so that got me kind of interested in, if we're going to look at the beginnings of these things, the origins of them, what we're seeing here is something that became so powerful in its first few years, or maybe the first century, or whoever knows, right? But it became so powerful that once the genie was out the bottle, it was here to stay. That you have to really mess up a country for the innovation train to stop.
Let's get to the book. Why this book, and what were you trying to answer or really get across?
Right. So I think the way to think about this book, so Arts and Minds, is that it's a case study of one of the more successful institutions that innovators themselves within Britain created to promote innovation. Right. So the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, 11 blokes in 1754 in a coffee house declare themselves to be such a society, is now the Royal Society of Arts. It still actually has that full title, but it's often abbreviated RSA or whatever. They create what is effectively Britain's national improvement agency, originally for inventions, and then kind of twisted to whatever ends that its members felt required improvements, such as artistic design, or collecting botanical specimens, or creating new trade routes with the colonies for Britain, and so on and so forth. And then, decade after decade, kind of transforming the way it does things and finding new niches, finding new gaps with which to fill. So in the first 100 years, it's this premium giving society. It gives prizes, or cash prizes or honorary medals, depending on the kind of people that they're trying to appeal to, for inventions that were not patented. So to complement, stand alongside the patent system. In the next, in the 1840s and 50s, it starts to transform itself into more of an exhibition holding society. So a very different model of innovation, where instead of just trying to use particular prizes, they try to get all of the inventions in the same room so that you can start to compare like with like, and you can spark these sort of serendipitous discoveries in that kind of way as well as concentrating on things like skills for the masses. So creating examination systems, supporting the mechanics institutions, or with the creation of a union of mechanics institutions, as well as all sorts of other means, and just lobbying for reforms to copyright, to patents, to all sorts of different structures around creativity and around innovation. And then taking that further in the modern day, in the 20th century, with all sorts of other different niches that it starts to get into, sometimes as random as trying to preserve London's old buildings by creating the blue plaque scheme, where you have these kind of lovely little plaques that say such and such famous person lived here, this date to that date. Very common today, but most people don't realize it emerged in that kind of foment of different ideas that they were coming up with and different schemes that they had. Or things like the preservation of ancient cottages, medieval and Tudor ones that were being torn down because of new sanitation laws and road widening in the early 20th century, or the environmentalist movement in the 1960s. So I guess in summary, in some ways, this book goes all over the place, and I was commissioned to write it by the RSA itself, although they were very lax in terms of allowing me to say whatever I wanted about the institution, kind of give my own take on it. But really, it's one example, I think, of how it is that British innovators in the 18th century not only created an institution that was quite unique, and actually it doesn't really fit into many common definitions of, I can't just say it's a learned society or it's a club or it's an association. There's actually nothing else quite like it, and actually spawns all sorts of foreign imitators, none of which seem to have lasted quite so long. But it's also a great example of how it is that British innovators were able to create very long-lasting institutions. One thing that's really striking, and I think this maybe comes to what's special about Britain in the 18th century and earlier as well, is that in terms of those subcultures creating themselves and then perpetuating, creating new subcultures that support innovation, I think there are a lot of lessons to be drawn from it in terms of how it is that you can do that successfully, and also for the long run. 266 years the society's been going. If you look at the Royal Society, the scientific one, which also had this innovation remit when it was founded, although it kind of dropped that pretty soon after and concentrated more on what we now call science, natural sciences. That's, that was founded in the 1660s and again has lasted to the present day.
Yeah. How would you you said there have been foreign imitators that haven't been successful. If you were trying to create one of those, how might you get started, or what's the right framework to think about it?
That's a really good question. I've been meaning to write something up on this actually, because interestingly, since the book came out, I have had a few people get in touch and ask, again, invariably inventors or innovators, people in those circles, saying, in my locality, it's usually not Silicon Valley, but in my locality, how is it that I could create something similar? I guess the thing to draw from British institutions in the 18th century, one of the key lessons, not just in the Society of Arts, but throughout a lot of the institutions they created, is that they were very often bottom up rather than top down. There's been a lot of focus recently on things like, so in Britain, we've had a new ARPA, or people trying to create these new top-down institutions, often government-funded ones that will support innovation. I think there's definitely room for that sort of thing within the innovation supporting ecosystem. But I think the thing that made Britain special in terms of creating these subcultures and then perpetuating them was the bottom-up nature. So the Royal Society, for example, which I mentioned, founded in the 1660s, not to be confused with the RSA. It's called Royal. It gets a mace as an indicator of royal approval, and they always have the expectation that they're going to get some funds from the king, but they never actually get any. And so it ends up actually being a bit like a membership society. And nowadays, to be an FRS, a Fellow of the Royal Society, is one of the highest accolades for any scientist to receive, or at least membership accolades for them to receive. But ultimately, it's still a bottom-up institution. It's one where they have to kind of scrounge about for donations, try and get membership dues to support themselves in a way, that structure themselves in a way that'll, I guess, be more robust to political changes. If they had been completely at the whim of Charles II, had James II or William III or Anne or George I just lost interest in that institution, that could have just meant all of their funds dried up, and then they would have been left stranded and unable to do anything. So I think there's something about British institutions that are often more robust. And I think that's an important element when trying to design something similar today. You should often try and look at what kind of bottom-up stuff you can do. So the Society of Arts, the subject of the book, it was from the beginning not a government institution. The Royal only gets added much, much, much later. And even then, it's a kind of honorary thing. And it was a direct democracy. So one person, one vote. And for the first 100 years or so, it's essentially whoever paid their subscription fee of 2 guineas a year or 20 guineas for life, they had a say in whatever it was that it did, how it was that they used that fund for the promotion of the public good. Usually for inventions. Sometimes the voters decided they would put their money into slightly more random things or things that maybe didn't work quite so well. And there's definitely a lot of trial and error involved. But I think part of what makes it so long-lasting is that it had that kind of element. So if you're looking at doing it today, I guess you'd try to work out how broad-based an institution do you want it to be. 2 guineas a year was actually a lot of money at the time. So it could have been a kind of club for relatively rich or well-off people. Whereas today, there was actually, for most of its history, it wasn't actually keeping its subscription levels up to inflation. So it was still 2 guineas, even in the early 20th century, when they finally started pegging it to inflation. Now it's about 100 and something pounds a year, which is kind of, when they started updating it, that's what it had been. So it's much, much more inclusive in that respect. But I think that's actually a decision that, were you to try and create something similar today, you'd want to look at, okay, well, how exclusive do I actually want this to be? How much decision-making do you want to vest in the population as large? I think a lot of organizations, they take pride in having very large memberships, and actually the society itself is similar to that. It now has 30,000 members, which is much more than it's ever had in its history. But it was, I would say, very successful, even with memberships in the low thousands. 2,000 in the 1760s, around 5,000, a bit more in the 1850s and 60s. So I think you can get a long way with smaller memberships, again, smaller groups. And I think it's worth thinking about that when designing similar things today.
Yeah. You mentioned Silicon Valley. Compare and contrast sort of some of the stuff we've been talking about in Britain with sort of the rise of Silicon Valley, or certain cultural or institutional norms or structures, and certain things that Silicon Valley, a lot of their listeners could learn from studying Britain. And then more broadly, I want us to get into this idea of just creating ecosystems in general, in the sense that a lot of people have been saying, how do we create the next Silicon Valley in X, Y, a place over the world? Is that the wrong question? Or first, let's compare and contrast Silicon Valley and some of the work you've done in Britain, and then let's talk about creating innovation ecosystems more broadly.
Yeah, I think the main difference between somewhere like Silicon Valley and Britain is that there's just a lot more money in Silicon Valley. It seems historically that it's probably the easiest it ever has been to get funding up front for a project that could be quite speculative. And I think that would have been extremely difficult in the 18th century. Usually they're relying on reinvested profits from existing businesses that they were in, or loans from a neighbor, or partnership with a rich lawyer neighbor who had some property income, or maybe a dowry. Bolton and Watt, they benefit quite a lot from the fact that Bolton marries into money. In fact, I seem to recall that he was meant to marry one of the sisters, so the sister of his eventual wife, but the sister died, and so he ends up marrying the younger sister. Again, kind of following the money and then using that for the creation of their very famous factory at Birmingham, the Soho factory. So, in terms of I guess one way to look at the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of the centres in it, was that they're operating under that constraint that, yes, they can get funding, but it's often extremely limited, at least by modern standards. And then also the kind of support systems that they have are certainly not as good when it comes to institutional support. So the patents did not last all that long. About 14 years was the norm in the 18th century, and also very, very badly enforced. You'd have to take the costs on to do it yourself. You'd have to, basically pay for spies to go to different factories and work out how many of your machines were being used, and then try to bring a case against them. So as well as it being extremely, almost unaffordable, effectively, people like Watt or John Wilkinson or Isaac Wilkinson and so on, iron metallurgist, they're kind of exceptional in the sense of even going around and suing people for patent infringement. So, yeah, I think one way to think of it is in those terms, that although they're creating the institutions to support innovation, a lot of the changes that they're coming up with are kind of happening on the fly. A lot of the reforms to the patent system, for example, actually come from inventors themselves, or their initiative, and then the state sort of responding to a lot of petitions, a lot of pleas. So I guess there are some lessons there actually for Silicon Valley today, right? There's all sorts of different, initiatives and problems with space constraints and rent and so on that are slightly different to the sorts of things that people would have had to worry about in the 18th century, when things like land for these things would have been relatively abundant. That said, you've also got, I think, in the Industrial Revolution, you've got a lot of different hubs and a lot of different centres. I think London, counterintuitively to, or rather counter to what a lot of people tend to think about the Industrial Revolution, is actually the main centre for invention. People tend to think of the North or the Midlands as being the centres. Actually, they're the centres of production. The centres of invention tend to be London. And that's probably not all that surprising, because London is absolutely massive compared to pretty much any other city in the country. Many, many, many times larger than the next largest city most of the time. And so that kind of hub is extremely important. And yet you also in the 18th century start to see this diffusion of hubs where places like Birmingham, famously, or Edinburgh, also somewhat famously, as well as various other regional centres, start to pop up and have their own mini hubs, often connected sort of tangentially to the London ones, but also kind of having a life of their own. And I think that's, again, one of these other things that makes things quite robust in Britain. Nowadays, I think there's a tendency of people to focus on particular industries and say, Silicon Valley is where all the innovation is at. And that's not quite true, right? Like, we actually have a pretty broad spread of inventors and innovators all over, not just the country, but the world. Lots of different hubs, often specializing in particular industries, and maybe at the cutting edge in terms of improving those industries, even if they're not working on industries that are brand new and exciting and shiny. So there's potentially, we're kind of having this kind of weird bias where we're looking at Silicon Valley and trying to recreate it, to answer your second question. Whereas actually we should be maybe looking at the sort of more minor hubs and actually appreciating for the fact that they are still hubs, and there is still quite a lot of activity coming out of them.
You mentioned that the first question you were really excited to answer is just how do we get economic growth, or what is sort of the history of it? In understanding that history as well as you do, what sort of misconceptions do you think people have, or where do you think people don't fully appreciate about what has led to it historically and perhaps what might lead to more of it in the future? Where is the conversation a little bit off?
I mean, there's a lot of cases actually of that. I think people have an intuitive, often wrong understanding of what growth is. First of all, I think they tend to equate it with stuff, which is why you get a lot of people who worry that infinite growth is this weird thing that you could never ever have. That our planet is finite, and people think that growth is infinite. Well, actually, growth is about value. So, and it's measured in value. It tends to be, and we equate it with, or it's a kind of GDP per capita is our best measure, I think, still of trying to work out how living standards are improving. And I think they track it fairly well, although actually they probably radically underestimate improvements in living standards because they don't really take into account things like quality improvements or the addition of new products and so on, because when you put things in real terms, you're actually trying to create a single unchanging basket that you have to keep rebasing it all of the time as new things become commonplace, right? So, in the basket of goods, when you're trying to account for inflation, nowadays you're going to have things like the internet and TV. Well, obviously those didn't even exist a few decades ago, certainly not a few centuries ago. And yet, so when you're calculating things in real terms, that can make things extremely tricky. And so it's underestimating it to an extent. But even so, GDP is measured in terms of value. It's how much value we're creating for others when we produce things. So my favorite example of this is, we could get GDP growth from me taking paper, a sheaf of paper, a pen, and my time, and writing a story about an 11-year-old English boy who was told, and actually is, a wizard. And it probably wouldn't be very good, and I doubt I'll sell very many copies. And yet someone else, J.K. Rowling, could use exactly the same inputs and create infinitely more value, creating something very similar, but probably a lot better. And so that effectively is one way of kind of framing what economic growth actually is. And I think most people in general don't really appreciate that that's how it works. They would, I think, assume that it's just about, how many cars, how many widgets, how much ore, how many whatever bits of stuff gets produced. I'm not really appreciating the kind of services or kind of other value-led elements of it. And so that, I think, also underscores the sources of it, is that when you start to interrogate how it is that growth works, a lot of people also have this kind of intuitive model that you need at some point to have had a sort of original accumulation of capital to really get things going. And once you've invested a bit in a slightly better technology, then things just spiral on from there. And so they focus on how it is that certain countries or certain people might have gotten a hold of capital, through conquest, through colonialism, through expropriation of some kind, perhaps through the gains from trade, without realizing that there's actually nothing automatic about those things being used in a way that takes existing inputs and creates more value out of them. So there's always been conquest, there's always been expropriation, but very rarely does that expropriation actually result in investment in something that isn't just pre-existing technologies or even just kind of excessive and wasteful consumption. So the key element to how it is that you get economic growth that is continuous and steady, what economists like to call modern economic growth, that requires not just invention, because actually each individual invention has diminishing marginal returns. If I invent one particular thing, I don't know, we go from plows to tractors, then once everyone's got a tractor and every farmer's using a tractor, we're not going to see continuous growth. Right? We actually need another invention, another one. We need more and more things to keep pushing that curve out there. So it's the acceleration of innovation that I think is particularly important. So in all of my writing, I try to actually shy away from even terms like the Industrial Revolution, and even avoid some of the debates about growth, because in some ways it can be unhelpful, and say, look, actually the thing I'm interested in is the sources of the acceleration of innovation. That is the cause of a lot of these other knock-on effects, and that's the thing that I want to explain. And if you think that's unimportant, fine. That is ultimately the phenomenon that I'm now interested in. I've given you a sort of, it's often the first lecture I give to World Economic History students is kind of similar to that.
Yeah. One thing you've written a lot about in your newsletter and otherwise is around statecraft and how it relates to economic growth. some people are saying that China sort of challenges our traditional notions of sort of ideal, government structures as it relates to economic growth. Where do you think there are misconceptions around it, or what do you think is important to understand as it relates to statecraft or governance and economic growth?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think policy probably matters more than structure in some ways. So a lot of the stuff I've been working on recently, so this is for book 2, which is this it's the same project, and actually it's an outgrowth of the original project even before I wrote Arts and Minds. A lot of the bits that I've been looking at recently have focused looking at the 17th century, which actually sort of counterintuitively, inventors are actually more successful politically than they are probably before or after that. And yet the fact that they're so successful, at least amongst as courtiers and in terms of getting the ear of the king and so on, the Elizabeth I, the Queen, and then especially the Stuarts, so James I, Charles I, and then to a lesser extent Charles II, is that they kind of, things get a bit cronyist. They get the patent system, which is created initially as a sort of almost like an immigration visa with a temporary monopoly on whatever foreign technique usually was being introduced to the country in the mid to late 16th century, that increasingly becomes something that's used through essentially royal diktat, right? A patent is an open proclamation by the monarch. So it's something that where they're using their prerogative powers, they're going around the need for anything like parliament and just saying, look, this is the monarch's right, can kind of suspend the law in this particular way and just say, look, here, I'm going to give a temporary monopoly on these things because they're important. And so a lot of inventors are they're kind of becoming, I guess, they're often called bloodsuckers of the Commonwealth, is I think one term in which an MP in the late 16th century refers to them, in that they start to not get patents for things that aren't necessarily inventions, or even if they are patents for inventions, they're then enforcing those monopolies in a way that actually covers a lot of other industries as well. And so there's a kind of huge amount of corruption that ensues from it. So in terms of political regimes, I'm not sure there's even anything especially kind of special about what the regime is. It's more to do with how it is that it kind of does affect its innovation policy. And in some ways, I would say that actually inventors become the tools of absolutism, in that the project of people like Charles I to turn England into an absolutist monarchy relies very much on using projectors or outsiders, inventors, often foreigners, certainly people who aren't often local to a particular area that's affected, to kind of bring in these industry-changing innovations and then give rewards or rents directly to the monarch in a way that supersedes a lot of the older structures like guilds and city corporations, all the kind of other rights that may have been given by Parliament, and often used as a way to circumvent the need for monarchs to even call parliaments. So in some ways, inventors can, I think, actually be the causes of particular political configurations even coming about. And so that's, I guess there's a whole mix of different things that I've mentioned there thematically, I suppose. It being that I think the context matters hugely there, and that we also need to not just be wary of what kind of policies affect invention, but also how, I guess, innovators and inventors affect policy, how it is that they can maybe bring about particular political regimes.
What are the big debates in it, whether it's looking historically at what's led to innovation, or whether it's looking forward as to sort of ecosystems or cultures or governments that lead to innovation? Like in the field, we look at other historians of innovation. What do you all have argue about, or potentially have differences of opinion, whether it's Matt Ridley or Joel or any of the others, or questions that you're still trying to answer?
Yeah, I mean, people like Ridley or John McKeer or Deirdre McCloskey, I think in some ways, so people like McKeer and McCloskey, I'm definitely in a similar tradition to them, in that in terms of looking at the Industrial Revolution, this period, all of us I think there is agreement that the acceleration of innovation is the thing to explain. And there's certainly, I've taken from them certain kind of facts, key facts, you might call them. So economists like to call them stylized facts about the period, from which we then have to the things we need to use as the building blocks to then build theories around. Things like the innovation of acceleration affected not just leading industries like cotton, coal, and steam engines or iron, but actually in any industry in the country seems to have been affected. Maybe even more than industries, that you get a lot of innovation that's from a similar source, but in all sorts of different fields. Everything from agriculture to watchmaking to, I've got inventors that I've studied who start applying the improving mindset, as I call it, to things like love letter writing and how it is that we organise the choir in the church to sing the hymns. So invention seems to be this kind of tidal wave that affects all industries. So that's one example. So the importance of innovation, the widespread way that innovation affected the country, those are some of those basic points of agreement. And I guess because of those points of agreement, I and some of these other people in that camp, I suppose, we focus on, for want of a better word, culture, I think more accurately subcultures or ideas, norms, institutions, but in a more informal way rather than just the formal political institutions like the law, like the structure of the government and so on, as being probably the more important things where we need to focus our attentions. Where I differ from them, certainly amongst a lot of other historians who look at the period, I differ on, I think, the importance of things like economic incentives with people like Robert Allen. I probably disagree with a lot of people about the importance of certain changes to trade patterns, the rise of the Atlantic economy. Certainly a lot of agreement there as well. But in terms of what's the more important thing that we should be looking at, I think there's a bit of disagreement there. And then when it comes to people like McCloskey, I think that, so she has this theory that, well, I guess a mental model of innovation, that innovation is this sort of thing that happens naturally. And if you were to take the boot off of the neck, if you were to thinking of the 1980, it was a boot in the face, right, for 1984. If you were to take the stone off the grass, then things will simply naturally grow. That if you provide dignity, if you provide liberty for inventors, then people naturally innovate. Whereas I actually disagree with that model and think that innovation is actually this extremely rare thing that very, very few people do. It's a bit like this sort of weird hobby that starts to spread from person to person amongst a very small group of people. And in that respect, I guess I have probably more similarities with someone like John McKeer, who does focus on, he likes to call it upper tier human capital. So it's actually the very top group of people who are shifting innovation, the technological frontier outwards. Yes, the skills in the population as a whole are extremely important for facilitating that, but actually the number of inventors and scientists are quite few. And so we need to study that relatively small group to work out what's going on. But even in his case, he has this focus on Enlightenment norms, or as he likes to call it, the industrial Enlightenment. And I think even for my taste, I think even that's a bit broad. And I think that in some ways you see that exhibited all over Europe. And he has, in his most recent book, Culture of Growth, a theory that says, actually, yes, all of Europe is experiencing these changes, but Britain just has a few other factors that just makes it a little bit more precocious than others, that had Britain not existed, maybe you'd have had something very similar happening in a different way, and perhaps more slowly, perhaps faster, who knows, in somewhere like France, in Italy, and Germany. And I think I probably broadly agree with that, because you actually do get a lot of invention throughout the period. And actually Britain in the 16th and 17th centuries is relatively backward technologically, scientifically. It's on the periphery of new advances, and often one of the last places in Europe to get them. And so, yeah, I think those are some of the ways in which I differ with with those authors. Ridley's, I've not actually read fully the latest book, but where I suspect I disagree with him is on things like invention versus innovation. This is one of his big things, taking from the economics literature in particular, this distinction that invention is the coming up with the idea, and maybe what matters actually more isn't so much that people come up with new ideas, it's their application to society as a whole. Usually, because it comes from economics, this is focusing on markets, but actually I think innovation and invention, personally, I think are almost indistinguishable. They're simply kind of different parts of the same process, and that most people actually use those two words pretty interchangeably. And I think in some ways that's actually analytically quite accurate. And really what we're looking at here is marginal improvements, but in lots of different domains. That it could be improvement to the process, it could be improvement to the design of the product, it could be improvement to the way in which the product is shipped or marketed, or what have you. But also that may not even be a market process at all, and that a lot of innovation affects government services, for example. How well organized the postal system is, which is another of the innovations of the period. So subtle differences, I guess.
How would you describe Deirdre McCloskey's core contribution to the literature?
I think McCloskey is one of the key, at least so that, McCloskey has an extremely long career of making quite a lot of really important contributions to the economic history literature, from things like the debates over whether or not Britain had this kind of decline in the late 19th century, to the enclosure debates, to the introduction of using a lot of cliometric measurement in the field at all in I guess the 70s and 80s, and Keir also kind of spearheading that. In terms of, I guess you're really asking about the later or more recent work, so the bourgeois dignity, bourgeois equality, the kind of mega books that she has recently, magnum opus, that she has released. I think the key contribution for me, having read those books, is about, I guess, getting at those really fundamental building blocks on which I think our theories that we take seriously about the Industrial Revolution should kind of satisfy those conditions. So as I mentioned, things like what we need to be taking seriously here is the acceleration of innovation. She spends a lot of bourgeois dignity going through a lot of other theories and questioning them, interrogating them, showing how they don't quite work. Now, the book is about 10 years old now, so a lot of those theories have developed or adjusted or tried to get around some of her critiques, and so maybe it's worth someone going through and kind of working out how that's changed. But I think that was a very valuable thing she did to clarify those points. But as I say, I actually disagree with the overall thesis about, once you take out the things that perhaps don't explain it, what's left. Her theory and mine are very similar in that they focus on ideas and subcultures, but they also differ in terms of their model of innovation.
The writer Peter Zeihan, who in his books, instead of focusing on culture and governance, and those are topics we focused on largely here, he focuses on demographics, geography, and energy in trying to understand why certain countries have been stronger than others. How do you react to that, or how do you make sense of that?
I'm not familiar with the work, so I'll have to check it out, but I can maybe speak to some of those theories in general, because obviously I have come across quite a few of them. So things like coal, for example, people love coal as an explanation of the Industrial Revolution. And actually what's interesting is physicists especially love coal as an explanation of the Industrial Revolution, because I guess there's a kind of appeal to particular constraints being lifted once you unlock the potential of fossil fuels. So, but I have a few problems with those sorts of explanations. Firstly, it's that to even unlock the potential of coal in the first place requires technology. And the fact that those things were invented in the first place comes in the middle of an acceleration of innovation, right? Coal-using technologies, maybe coal-using technologies are pretty important. I'm not going to deny that at all. They certainly have these outsized effects compared to a lot of other types of innovation. But things like coke smelting of iron, that's happening at the same time as roughly as all sorts of changes to surgical technique, to hygiene, to other ways in which living standards are affected. And actually the application of coal to lots of different industries and to heating in particular, these happen over a very extended period of time, and again with lots of inventors involved who also are involved with inventing all sorts of other things as well. So in some ways I see the use of coal and the unlocking of these constraints as more a result of the acceleration of innovation, one of its many results rather than a cause. But also I can see a world in which maybe we didn't unlock the potential of coal. Would growth have been slower? Yes. Would populations have been lower? Also, probably yes, right? It unlocked a lot of potential there in terms of getting around the basic land constraint that we could, instead of having to deforest the entirety of the British Isles, or majorly place strain on forests in, I guess, the rest of Europe, especially in the Baltic, or perhaps North America. That we could dig down instead of spreading out, that we could devote more land to other uses, such as to textiles or to food production in particular, with which we could then support much higher populations. And then from those high populations get more innovation and just all sorts of other benefits from agglomeration, from concentrating all these people as well. But as I said, I can also see a path we could have taken where, had coal not existed, could we have also had all sorts of living standards improving innovations? Absolutely. I think there's maybe room for someone to write a kind of alternative counterfactual history book trying to explore what that would have even looked like. But, a lot of other materials that were becoming increasingly common, they didn't necessarily rely on coal until much, much later. Or they were the sorts of things that could have used alternative fuels like peat, like biomass, so turning wood into charcoal and then using that. And also there have been calculations done by economic historians trying to work out, how much would it have cost British GDP per capita over the long run had we had to import our fuel from the Baltic rather than having these domestic sources of coal. And the impact doesn't seem to be all that great. Now, I think some of those calculations may need revisiting. This is a paper by Clark and Jacks, if listeners want to look it up. It's a really interesting kind of approach to just trying to work out how to actually quantify what is the effect here, given the next best alternatives, right? So to use imported wood instead of using coal. And the impact doesn't seem to be especially huge there. So I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's something like 9%. Which is, that's significant, right? That's a big knock to living standards, but it's not the end of the world, and it's not necessarily saying that the trend of this continuous upwards, almost exponential graph, is not to say that would have been stifled altogether.
Next, I want to talk briefly about. I'm curious where you disagree with Peter Thiel at all, and I'll say a couple things he refers to, but also feel free to bring up any others. So one is just the stagnation thesis more broadly, and I think he's echoing sort of Robert Gordon's rise and fall of economic growth, particularly specifically the growth rate. And I think he then credits it to a combination of regulation and culture, that we've just become way less ambitious, or as a culture. Nixon declared sort of I can't remember, war on cancer. Someone else might have declared war on Alzheimer's. I think you said we would never today declare, trying to end Alzheimer's. We've just become way less ambitious on a national level, but also on an individual level. We sort of deny it by saying that technology is either moving is too fast, and that's either going to be great, or too fast and it's going to be terrible, but not that it's moving too slow relative to what it used to be. What are your takes on some of these topics?
So I kind of buy the argument from people like Dietz Vollrath, which is that actually things are improving at pretty much the same rate as they had when it comes to technology, but that growth is being lowered by various other factors, most of which we've actually chosen voluntarily. So he's applied this to the US. I'm not sure how the figures translate to places like the UK or to the rest of Europe, but it seems as though quite a big chunk of the growth slowdown that people like Gordon has identified is really due to things like demographic factors, that we have fewer kids, and which means, if you have less of a labour input because there are fewer additional people entering the labour force all the time, every year, then you're also going to have lower outputs as a result. But it's not as though we didn't choose that, right? It's us making the choice to have fewer kids because, maybe we just value our time, or the relative cost of having children has changed because of the potential benefits of leisure and so on. travel and eating out at restaurants and that kind of thing, which is something we've long known about as this was work by I think Gary Becker, kind of applying economics to the family and to those sorts of decisions. So part of it's things like that. Part of it's also the kind of, we take a lot more leisure time. We work less in many ways overall. People retire. We spend longer in full-time education. So in terms of the total amount of hours, in terms of our working lives that we'll devote to things like production that then get measured in terms of things like GDP, that has potentially been lowering again for good, right? The fact that we get more leisure time, the fact that we get, and by the way, significantly more leisure time than in any of the recent past. The fact we even have 2 days off at a weekend is actually quite historically quite significant. Used to be 1 day, used to basically be none. Those are the sorts of things that are good, but they have this effect on economic growth, at least in terms of how we measure it. And so his argument is kind of that we should in some ways relax. That said, there are, of course, things that we could do to improve economic growth rates, where there are. This is not a Panglossian thing to say that everything's fine, relax. We should, I think, still be worried about the rate of technological progress. We should be constantly, as I think our ancestors did, try to reinvent institutions that support innovation for the present day if they seem to be becoming unfit for purpose, if they don't seem to be quite pulling their weight. Try to focus on the sorts of reforms that may enable things, lobby for things like, for example, more efficient land use. So, for example, trying to look at planning permissions and zoning restrictions and the effects that they may have on economic growth and on innovation in general. The ability of people to cluster into cities and have these great agglomeration effects. All of those, there are, of course, barriers that he identifies to it as well. But I definitely don't take that. I guess I do take it seriously, but I don't believe this theory that we've kind of just run out of low-hanging fruit, that we've kind of just mined all of the ore when it comes to certain types of technology and that's it, which seems to be Gordon's thesis, that we had these big leaps forward, but that was because the realm of what was physically possible has now been explored in particular ways, and we're now running out of those things, and so we're going to get this kind of permanent stagnation. I just don't buy that at all. Like daily, we seem to be seeing new things that are completely pushing out the boundaries of what it is that we even knew was possible. In the same way that, to people of the past, right, if I showed them an iPhone, they would kind of lose their minds because it doesn't even seem like the world, the laws of physics would have even allowed for these sorts of things to even exist. And I think we're continuing to see that with advances in genetics. Things like genome sequencing, I don't think anybody expected it to be quite so rapid as it is now, even just a few years ago. And the kind of potential that unlocks for things like our ability to treat disease and to find cures to all sorts of other things as well, just as an example.
Say more about the culture, the critiques that Peter and others have had. You wrote a piece about statues at one point, but say where you think we needed a change in the culture, or where there's merit to it, or
right. So I guess one thing to be wary of for people in Silicon Valley, for inventors, for people who are excited about invention, is that we do need to actually think about what kind of cultures or subcultures we want to create. And I think there was often a very conscious effort throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries to do that. So in the 17th century, a lot of it focuses on how do we get away from the reputation we've created for ourselves as inventors as being cronies of the state, these bloodsuckers of the Commonwealth. How do we actually get people, not just the monarch, to take innovation seriously? So I guess you could, if I were to kind of sketch it out briefly, the 16th century is when inventors in England are trying to get elites, mercantile elites who've got money, and the state who can give them the privileges and the kind of dispensations and from regulation and the kind of patents and various other kind of things to kind of ease the passage of various projects, innovative projects, to get those people to take them seriously and to value them as experts, as innovators. Then, in the 17th century, after this all goes completely terribly wrong, with all of the attacks that you get in Parliament on monopolies, on monopolists, a lot of it in some ways culminating in the English Civil War. You've then got this cultural project to try and make inventors, projectors as they come to derisively be known, be seen as being valuable members of the Commonwealth, as people who are actually creating inventions that increase living standards for everyone and aren't just these kind of pernicious cronyist monopolies. And then in the 18th century, you've got the creation of all of these other institutions like the Society of Arts, right? The use of medals to try and get people who wouldn't necessarily be inventors usually, so richer aristocrats or people who want to demonstrate that they're inventing things for the public good and not just for their pecuniary gain. That's, again, a cultural project, and creating institutions that raise the status of people who are pushing the technological frontier. And then that kind of goes even further in the 19th century, where you get these projects to, for example, value inventors historically. So lots of statues of inventors popping up all over the place, in addition to the statues of generals and politicians, to try and say, look, these are also people who are a part of our culture. So you get, for example, lots of people who are interested in invention trying to get a statue put up to Gutenberg to celebrate printing and the invention of the printing press, and just to kind of really focus on heroes, if you like, that people can rally around and try to emulate. And you see this especially in the 1860s with things like the publication of Samuel Smiles's book Self-Help, one of the most popular books ever printed at the time. Sorry, not ever printed, but one of the most popular books printed at the time. Instant bestseller, pretty much. And it's basically just the story of various inventors pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and becomes this source of inspiration to a whole new generation of inventors. Now, that sort of thing is in some ways myth-making, and may in some ways be seen as being, when people look at Self-Help by Samuel Smiles, they say, yes, in some ways it's an important historical document because he actually did go and interview a lot of people and got a lot of really interesting traditions and actually put that down in writing so we can use it in some ways as a historical source. But we've also got to be very careful, because his agenda here is that he is an invention cheerleader, that he is someone who is trying actively to get people to become inventors. And so I think those sorts of cultural projects we need to take very seriously. To be honest, I see that, right? A lot of the people, the fact that you are, for example, interviewing me, and the fact that you've got people commenting on culture like Teal, I guess slightly more tangential people, Tyler Cowen, the fact that you've got people like Patrick Collison at Stripe commenting on the need for something like progress studies, a whole new field, potential kind of multidisciplinary project that takes these sorts of questions seriously, suggests to me that actually this project you're seeing the current generation of inventors and their cheerleaders taking up that mantle, and again having to cater it to the specific current context, right? The kinds of solutions I think that we see today need to be informed by the history, but they're going to have to be different, given that things are different, that the kinds of culture that we get, the kinds of critiques that you get, right? I know there's this kind of rivalry between tech journalists and technologists a lot of the time, or this kind of grousing about what one is saying about the other. Those are exactly the sorts of battles in a different way, or challenges in a different way, that people in the 17th century, let's say, are worrying about when the satirists are deriding them for being projectors with, all sorts of crazy schemes.
Let's talk about progress studies for a second, because I see you mentioned sort of shining examples of the culture sort of evolving and beginning to evaluate that. I see that as fundamentally reactionary in some sense, but just I'm supportive of it, but sort of responding to a lot of culture, which is sort of like, guillotines at outside Jeff Bezos' house, which is sort of like anti-capitalist, anti-Western, and is in fact been sort of institutionalized at the university level. Someone once said that progress studies is to neoliberals what gender studies is to, sort of the far left. And
interesting. I've not heard that. That's very interesting.
It just seems as sort of in stark contrast to many of the other disciplines that have seemingly, infested other disciplines with sort of anti sort of capitalist rhetoric. Do you not see it that way, or how do you think about it?
No, I'm not sure I do see it that way. I think the success of progress studies is partly born out of the reaction, but I think that's more something that happened after it. I'm not sure it's the source of it. So I think it created a sort of banner, that article that Patrick and Tyler put out in The Atlantic, created a banner around which people could rally who had been thinking this, I think, for years and years and years, right? And maybe just hadn't had a name or a label for the kind of particular set of beliefs or priorities, I guess is a more accurate way of putting it, that they already had. So I think, with any kind of subculture creation, I think you need to have, I guess, banners, but those banners are often kind of revealing what's already sort of there, or relabeling what's already there. So there's a sort of power in the language, if you like, to do that. I don't think it's a reaction or a kind of protest in any way against a particular way that things are going. If anything, the kinds of thing it's pushing back on more against, I suppose, would be the sorts of critiques that people like Thiel have been coming up with. Now, I know that Tyler Cowen has his own stagnation thesis, in some ways agrees, but in some ways it's a kind of more positive call to arms to study the causes and then come up with solutions if that kind of thing is a problem. And actually, what's interesting is the stagnation thesis, even if, I disagree with it, but it's actually in a way been useful in exactly the same, like a useful myth, in exactly the same way that the myth of the inventor in the 19th century may have been a useful myth. It could have been completely untrue. But if it got more people to be inventors, or if the stagnation thesis has got more people thinking about creating institutions to get over this problem, I think sometimes identifying problems that aren't there can in some ways be good.
Right. Of course, the Mark Andreessen, it's time to build blog post, and this Tanner Greer, this writer, wrote a blog post basically saying that the reason we're not a culture that builds is because we instead are a culture that asks, "Can I talk to the manager?" Tries to spend so much time trying to convince management as opposed to focus on building. Fighting over the scraps of a limited pie rather than expanding the pie. And it's sort of my theory is that, like, not to be too crude on it, but like the meek have inherited the earth, in the sense that, like, Mark Zuckerberg is not popular. Like, Jeff Bezos is not popular. Like, a lot of these inventors, a lot of these companies are not popular. People are, they're not seen as by half or even majority of the population, even within the tech industry, as sort of these people who are, giving, unequivocally good stuff to the world. And there is this sort of just resentment politics that has sort of taken over culture and infected institutions. And I think that's what Thiel is perhaps commenting on. And I agree, progress studies is responding to the Thiel critique and trying to provide an alternative. But it seems that this is gaining power in America and being exported globally. And I'm curious, I mean, I've described it in very broad strokes, but it's sort of critical theory applied to everything. I'm curious if that at all resonates, or if you don't see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, actually, because I think that sort of critique or that worry exists within actually a very small but vocal group of people, right? I think in general, if you were to poll the population as a whole and you said, do you use and like Facebook? I think most people are like, yeah, I love it. Same with Google, right? This is just a thing that people use all the time. And they're like, yeah, it works pretty well. And, I'm relatively positive towards the company. Maybe Facebook less so. Zuckerberg gets a lot more flack for things. I think Google, doesn't have it quite so bad. But actually, I think in the general population is relatively relaxed about these things. The same with Uber. I reckon if you were to poll population as a whole, they'd be relatively relaxed with it, and they're actually broadly positive. Now, amongst the literati, people who tweet the most, people who are engaged with politics the most, who write the most, I guess amongst those sorts of people, yes, you do see this kind of skepticism, you do see this questioning, and sometimes rightly so, right? There are infractions. In the same way that in the 17th century, you've got to take seriously the critiques of monopolists. I think the critiques in technology could be probably similar. But one thing I'll come back on, which was very interesting that you said, this kind of idea or Tanner Greer's idea that it's asking the manager. What's interesting to me about that actually is asking the manager is much more ambitious. than just trying to build something yourself. Because when you ask the manager and you try to get a change, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a framework that applies not just to your locality, not just to your own activities, but to everybody's activities, right? So when you lobby for a reform to the law, you're trying to lobby for something that changes the entire structure for absolutely everybody in every single way. Now, for me, that's kind of interesting because you only really start to see those sorts of lobbying efforts amongst groups like the Society of Arts in the 1850s with the influence of utilitarianism. So Bentham's and John Stuart Mill's acolytes who feel that when you do good, it should be, the greatest good for the greatest number. And so it should be for everybody, for the masses, when you try to get reforms through. In the same way that I guess in some ways you can maybe see that, although I think it's less direct in terms of the genealogy of this idea, with the shift to exhibitions versus which, thousands or millions of people can attend versus using prizes, which maybe affect a single inventor and maybe have this particular effect on a very small industry rather than having these kind of nationwide or even worldwide effect. So one thing I think that's maybe interesting about the kind of building movement is in some ways we should maybe kind of dial down the ambition there in terms of what we want to do with it. Right? I guess there's this obsession with scale a lot of the time when it comes to new technology. And maybe we should celebrate the fact that actually a lot of the time coming up with a new technology has a very local effect. Maybe it's not going to make you famous, maybe it's not going to make you super rich, but actually it can have a huge amount of good. So I've been reading about projects of the 16th and 17th centuries, the work of a relatively unknown, but actually quite well known in her time from a few decades ago, economic historian called Joan Thirsk. And she points out that really kind of almost, I guess, parochial, kind of boring projects, unlike the cotton, the steam, and that kind of exciting stuff in the Industrial Revolution, could have this dramatic impact on England or certain areas of England. So things like growing woad. So I don't know. When I think of woad, I always think of woad raiders from Age of Empires 2. But growing woad, this dye, the blue dye, seems to have had this huge impact in terms of the amount of people that it employed. It's the introduction of a relatively unused or new crop, or certainly at a greater scale in the mid-16th and late 16th centuries, to the extent that actually it kind of seems to affect imports so much that the government goes out and decides to ban it because they would rather it was imported and people would pay the duties on it. So even these minor things, I think, when we talk about building, I guess we should be focusing on the ambition that we have for that. And yeah, I guess I agree that it's a good thing to have more of that, but we shouldn't get so carried away with it being this kind of national or international level effect.
No, I appreciate. I think the pushback on the manager thing is smart. It's a good counter. I haven't heard that counter. Anton, for people who want to learn more about your work, where can you point them? And please give a plug for your next book or what to expect in the future.
Oh, great. So AntonHowes.com, all one word, is, well, I guess not the .com, but Anton Howes, all one word, and then .com is my website. I have a Substack, which I post, I guess, every week or fortnight or so, which is antonhowes.substack.com. That's, I guess, the main way to find me. Also Twitter @AntonHowes, again, all one word. And then my book, which is out right now, came out a few months ago, is Arts and Minds, How the Royal Society of Arts Changed the Nation. And it's available, I guess, everywhere.
Excellent. Anton, this has been a fantastic podcast episode. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.